In New Hampshire, the issue of privatized prisons has come up off and on over the years, but it came up in a big way after the 2010 election, when our legislature got taken over by an extremely conservative majority in both the House and in the Senate. And as they were considering the budget in 2011, first a proposal surfaced to ship 600 prisoners to private prisons in other states, supposedly as a way to save money. That got shot down when they realized that it wasn't going to save any money. But then as the budget was getting completed, the fine print of what's called a HB2, or the budget trailer document, pages and pages and pages of fine print that accompanies the budget, were a couple of items. One was a mandate for a legislative committee to be created to develop a plan to privatize the Department of Corrections. And along with that, the department was ordered to send out proposals for privatization of correctional services. It was pretty vague, but this actually matched with the agenda of John Lynch, the longtime Democratic governor of New Hampshire, who for years had been thinking that perhaps a large prison could get built for prisoners from New Hampshire, but also Maine and Vermont. And Governor Lynch seemed to have the idea that a privatized facility would make it possible to do that. So he jumped right on board with this, and with the Department of Corrections and Department of Administrative Services, a request for proposals was sent out in the fall of 2011, right at the time that this legislative privatization committee was starting to meet. It took the state a full year. Actually, it took until the following April until responses from the private companies came in to this very expansive RFP, or request for proposals. We ended up with 4 private prison companies submitting 17 different proposals to try to meet the different specs that the state had offered as possibilities. And then the state said, gosh, this is a whole lot of detail. We don't even have the resources to figure it out ourselves. They send out another RFP to hire a consultant to help them. And then after the consultant was hired, it took them until April of 2012 to finish it up. So meanwhile, this legislative committee started meeting, and I started running into people from other organizations over at the State House. And this included people from the State Employees Union, which represent some of the corrections workers. It included people from the League of Women Voters, which is very concerned in particular about incarcerated women. It included leaders of a grassroots group called Citizens for Criminal Justice Reform, people from legal assistance, the criminal defense lawyers, and we started, since we started seeing each other, we said, you know what, we shouldn't just meet like this. We should start on a more concerted way of getting together. So we formed an informal coalition called New Hampshire Prison Watch that began to do some research, compiling information from places like Arizona, because it turned out that Caroline's research was just starting to get cranked out during this period of time. So I was able to then bring Caroline's information over to these different legislative meetings. And we decided, wouldn't it be a cool thing to bring Caroline herself to New Hampshire? So in the fall of 2011, we imported Caroline from Tucson and had her tour around New Hampshire for a few days, in particular going to places where some of these private companies had said they might like to site a private facility. We also started doing outreach to other groups, including church groups, and soon we had the Episcopal Church issuing a very strong statement against privatization. That was followed up by the United Church of Christ issuing a very strong statement, and our coalition really continued to expand. We began to meet with members of the New Hampshire Executive Council, which is a peculiar group in the state, which actually the governor does not have much power to simply issue these types of contracts. It has to be ratified by the Executive Council, which is another elected group of 5 people. So we started trying to talk with them to see if we could encourage their skepticism about this whole concept of privatized prisons. And again, these issues that Caroline mentioned of cost, accountability, public safety were all issues that we were able to hammer on over and over again with all the different people that we talked to, Republican or Democrat. By the time the 2012 election came around, we were in pretty good shape because we could tell that public opinion in New Hampshire was shifting in our direction. That although these 4 private companies had hired professional lobbyists to represent their interests at the State House, that the work of our private coalition was much more effective than they were at actually reaching the members of the public and shifting public opinion, so that in particular, as we went into the 2012 election, we found ourselves with the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate both taking positions against privatization on moral and economic grounds. And then we ended up with a less hostile to our view legislature, which came into office in January of 2012 while the state was still considering the privatization option. We drafted legislation together, working with legislators. We came up with legislation that would ban the practice of privatization. It was adopted by the New Hampshire House of Representatives in a strong way. While that policy was on its way over to the state Senate, finally the report came back from the state's consultants and from the Departments of Corrections and Administrative Services with conclusions that really matched our own. They looked at the proposals from these 4 companies. They said, you know what? These companies didn't even tell us how they were going to do the things that we asked them to do, which are necessary for New Hampshire to abide by the law in terms of how we run our systems. And moreover, from looking at the kind of wages that these people would be paying in the financial models that they have shared with us, the wages are so low that they won't be able to hire qualified people in order to serve in the prisons, and that conditions in the prison would suffer and public safety would suffer as a result. Well, this is exactly what Caroline found in Arizona. This is exactly what allied groups have found in other states that have looked into this. So at that point, even though the state's consultant was one that we were suspicious of because of their own connections to the private prison industry, we thought this was a very good report. We cheered it on. The sad news, however, is that despite all that great work that we were able to do, we were not able to get this proposal to, by legislation, ban prison privatization through the state Senate. Our bill was defeated by a vote of 13-11, but Alexis, I guess you could say that simply sets us up for our agenda for the coming legislative session. And we're now in conversations more closely with groups in Maine and Vermont, which have some similar interests. We think the groups have a lot in common. There are movements against privatization in those other states, and we're trying to figure out if we can now come up with a Northern New England agenda to stop the forward advance of privatized prisons in this part of the world.